and welcome to Girls Lunch, your mealtime companion where we talk about food, gender, sexuality, and where everyone is welcome.
Everyone is welcome. I'm Julia Andreas.
And I'm Nicole Hilton.
And Nicole, what are we talking about today?
Today is our long-awaited, at least for you and me, American Girl Cookbook special. Something that we have been thinking about and talking about for a little while, and since it was recently your birthday.
My birthday!
And we're getting to fun summertime, we thought, as if this podcast isn't already just super self-indulgent, we thought we would do something even more self-indulgent and talk about American Girl cookbooks.
It's true. And if we sound a little different today, it's because I am here in the room.
We are in the same room recording live.
In the same in the same place, trying not to talk over each other.
Yes.
Yeah. That'll be an editing nightmare.
Yay.
Nightmares.
So definitely before we start the episode proper, we need to give credit to Darling Dolls on YouTube for the idea. So they are a doll collector, and they did a video where they bought the cookbooks, these American Girl cookbooks, and made some of the meals from them. They, and I think their fiance, tested out some of the recipes. So I sent that to Julia, and we were like, oh my god, this is also so within the purview of our podcast. So we are kind of stealing the idea, but we are expanding on it at the same time. It's not a complete, rip-off, I hope.
We're adding to the ethos.
Adding historical context.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely wanted to give a shout out to Darling Dolls on YouTube. Please check out their channel for lots of fun, thoughtful video essays on dolls, doll collecting, including American Girl, Barbie, Monster High, and even some Sailor Moon, which is how I found the channel. So.
Ooh.
Okay, so Julia, can you tell the people at home, mostly my husband, what are American Girl dolls if you are unfamiliar?
Okay, so American Girl dolls are a fairly large size doll, I would say.
I think they're 18 inches?
18 inches, yeah, which is over a foot if you can't do inches. And they look chubby, but they're not babies. They're not Barbie where they're full grown. They're kind of in between.
Yeah.
The target audience is around 9, 10, I think.
Yeah.
8, 9, 10. And so, they kind of look around that age and are all based in sort of historical time periods in America. So to get into a little more of the history of it, American Girl dolls were founded in 1986 by Pleasant Rowland, former...
I think it's Rowland. Sorry.
Actually, you can't read. Founded in 1986 by Pleasant Rowland, a former school teacher, as the Pleasant Company, which was sold to Mattel in 1998. So, had a good 10 years there. The original series of American Girl dolls is 3 dolls. Molly, who is set in 1944, Kirsten, who is in 1854, and Samantha, who is in 1904. This trio of 3 quickly expanded into a core 6. So they added Felicity, who's from 1774, Addie, who's from 1864, and Josefina, who is from 1824. And we'll actually be talking about 2 of those today, Kirsten and Samantha.
Yeah, so the sort of gimmick, I would say, with American Girl dolls is each doll is from a different time period in American history. She has a set of 6 books that come with her that, sort of tell her story about, going to school, celebrating different holidays, birthdays, lots of different, social issues that we'll talk about later. The idea is thinking about what would it be like to be specifically a girl or a child at this point. Because it's one thing to think about the American Revolution and fighting in the war, but how would that affect a 9-year-old?
Yeah. It's about that time period through a young girl who's just about to hit adolescence eyes, which, as a 9-10-year-old, I really enjoyed.
Huge. Yeah, and so since they are dolls, so I think Pleasant Rowland originally intended them as educational tools, but also that's obviously changed, especially since the acquisition by Mattel. But, you can buy outfits, accessories, they come with little pets and little furniture, and usually, at least back in the day, nowadays you can order it online because you order everything online.
Yeah.
But back in the day, these would come by mail order catalogs, right? So I don't know if you remember. This was very exciting for me.
Oh, I remember.
To get those glossy, really pretty catalogs in the mail. When they would come in the mail, I'd spend so much time just like thumbing through and like looking at all the pretty pictures. And I know we're still sort of like spinning up here, but I think we should at least take a minute to talk about who's our favorite American Girl dolls.
Okay, so my favorite American Girl doll was Kaya, who was a Native American indigenous girl of the Nez Perce tribe up in the Pacific Northwest. And her story takes place in the late 1700s, I believe. So this is post-European American contact. And I loved her so much. I loved her hair. I loved her clothes. I had her horses. I had her teepee. I had her dogs and her little dog sled. And I loved her to literal pieces.
Oh. So I have to say, I think my favorite two would be Felicity, who we sort of mentioned. She's from like the Revolutionary era. She's a horse girl, which I was at the time as well. And then my other favorite was Kit Kittredge. Kit is like a spunky girl from the 1930s, so it's, the Great Depression. Her family's kind of struggling. Her dad loses his job, so they are just sort of trying to find ways to get by. And Kit is like, wants to be a reporter. She's like a, wannabe journalist. She's very adventurous. I don't know.
Sophie, my little sister, had Kit.
Okay, so I think we have done enough reminiscing, and we should get to the core of the podcast. So I think, Julia, you're going to go first.
I'm going to go first. So our idea for this podcast episode was to each get a American Girl doll cookbook and kind of like talk about like the time period where it's set and like cooking in that time period, and then try a recipe or two from the time period. So who I chose was Kirsten Larson, partially because she's a pioneer going out west. And
like you.
Just like me. Going out west, although I didn't stop in Minnesota, I kept going.
And you're not Swedish.
And I'm not Swedish that I know of. I don't think so.
Yeah.
But Kirsten is a Swedish pioneer who makes her way west with her family in 1854 to settle in Minnesota. And Kirsten's story covers her and her family leaving Sweden, taking the ocean voyage to New York, and then the trek to their new farm in Minnesota. So it kind of goes to like the whole thing. Like it starts with like her saying goodbye to her friends in Sweden, and then like the boat ride, and then also like the wagon ride and all of that. It's pretty intense. She struggles with learning English once she's settled and feeling at home in a strange new place, new country, and balancing the hard work a farm requires with schoolwork, cholera outbreaks, relationships with the local Dakota tribe that was driven out. She makes a friend whose name is Singing Bird, which I think is cute. The description for Singing Bird is like, even though Kirsten and Singing Bird don't speak the same language, they became fast friends. And I'm like, that's super cute.
Yeah, I was rereading some of the books. I'm very curious to know if they really consulted like Indian encounter narratives, you know what I mean? Because it did feel like that. Like there's a chapter where Kirsten goes to the village and like talks to the chief, and the chief is like, you teach my daughter English. You are friend. You are welcome here. And I'm like, interesting.
I think there's mixed reviews.
It's,
I think people might not be totally
It's probably a very 1986 version of history.
Yeah. I just remember, like, I was skimming through, like, what each book's about, and it was just like, Kirsten does this. Kirsten goes to school. Kirsten's, like, mom has a baby. Kirsten fights a bear. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
And so there's definitely one where it's, like, the cover is just Kirsten and, like, her brother, and there's just, like, a bear, and she's just, like, gonna fight the bear. And I'm like, okay, dang, all right.
She's putting up them dukes.
She's fighting a bear. Her cookbook talks about cooking on the Pioneer, what Pioneer kitchens were like, and how Swedish immigrant families at the time, like, set their table. Pretty basic to every American Girl cookbook. It's broken up into breakfast, dinner, and Kirsten's favorite foods, with a special section at the end for planning a pioneer party.
Yeehaw.
Which I'm just like, I don't know if them pioneers had a lot of time to party. It was a tough time. But cooking on the frontier was, like I said, pretty difficult. The pioneers who went west had very, very little. Max Miller from Tasting History has a great episode on, like, the Oregon Trail. And it's pretty heartbreaking because, like, you might have started out with your wagon, like, full of stuff, but pretty much, like, a weekend you had to throw stuff out.
Stuff gets nasty, too. And then...
Yeah. It gets nasty, and then, like, there was a certain part... Gosh, I'm trying to remember. I think it's, like, a mountain pass where if your wagon is, like, too loaded, it can't go up the hill. And so, like, you had to just, like, unload a bunch of stuff because you can't have your wagon be too heavy. And people were giving up, like, all these heirlooms that they took from, like, Sweden or, like, wherever they're coming from and brought, like, all the way across America. And then you hit the Rockies and you had to throw it away.
Man.
It was very sad.
It's just like the game Oregon Trail, where you have to decide if you're going to try to float your wagon across the river or if you're going to ferry it. And I feel like every time my wagon always just drowned.
Yeah, because
like
you don't want to
everybody
give
drowned and
stuff
died.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pioneers who went west had very, very little. Swedish families immigrating to the United States were often only able to bring like one large trunk that had all of the family's belongings. So not just like your belongings, but like your mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters, and yours. And it was not a glamorous life. Families shared a one-room log cabin. And so there's actually a museum in Bozeman that has a recreation of like one of these big log cabins. It is about the size of the room we're sitting in. So it's like, 11 feet across or something like that?
Yeah.
And that would have your dining room, your kitchen, your bedroom, the bathroom, all of it, just in this one space. It was very, very crowded. And yeah, it was cozy. And if you walk into like the Gallatin History Museum and you step into the cabin, you're like, how did you fit 5 people in here?
Yeah. It kind of is like, I guess it makes sense that, because also in the book, something else that keeps coming up that's wild to me today, but that I guess sort of makes sense, is Kirsten has an older brother, who, by the way, his name is Lars, and the family's, like, name is Larson, so her brother's name is literally Lars Larson. Like, can you get more Swedish than this? I don't think so.
That's pretty Swedish.
But anyway, so Lars's, like, little description is, like, he's 14 and almost a man. And I'm like, he's a child. Like,
that's
what?
A child.
But I guess, like, living in a cramped space like that, like, you... As soon as you're, I guess, big enough, it's like, all right, go get your
out of here.
Yeah, get out of here.
Yeah. So growing up on the frontier, children were expected to do their fair share of the work, you know, cooking, fetching water, cleaning, farm work, childcare, etc. Kirsten's books talk about this a lot, how, like, she would help her mom cook in the morning, she would help clean, she would go fetch the water from the river to bring back to clean, doing, like, laundry, she would help with, like, gardening, and when her mom has the baby, she helps take care of the baby. And one of the books talks about how, like, she has to stop going to school because she has to take care of the kid. They could really only eat what they grew. And I think that's, like, all the way back to, like, growing grain. If they wanted bread, they had to grow the grain for the bread. They had to raise cows and goats if they wanted milk, butter, or cheese. They had to raise chickens for eggs. And any, like, meat that they had, like pork or venison, like, they would either have to raise or hunt or trap. So you basically, the grocery store was the great outdoors and whatever you could find.
You're living off the land.
You're living off the land. If they did happen to have surplus by, like, you know, the end of a season or something, they could sell or trade for things that they could not make, like spices or sugar. Obviously, this was a very fragile way of living. Like, if your cow died, you would have no milk or butter or cheese. If your crops failed, you would have no grain for bread, and you would have no potatoes, which would be very sad.
It would be sad.
I love
Imagine
potatoes.
a world without potatoes.
So in every log cabin, you had a cook stove, and that was the central fixture of every home. It warmed the cabin in the winter, so, like, those old Minnesota winters must have been terrible. Be very happy to have a big old hot stove in there. And it was the one-stop shop for doing all of your baking, doing all of your cooking, boiling water for cleaning your dishes, and doing the laundry. It basically kept the home running. We've talked about before how these old cast iron cook stoves had no way to manage a temperature besides managing the fire. And just like in previous episodes, you had to stick your hand into like the oven and see how long you could hold it there to know like how hot it was. So for baking bread, you want it to be like 20 seconds of your hand in there. And as we've already said, we all know.
You'd burn your hand.
I'd burn my hand
It'd be
to
a
a crisp.
Yep.
I'd be like, it's 30 seconds, 35 seconds. There's a little picture of a cook stove.
Oh, it's cute.
It's cute.
You're definitely right about, like, as you said, a very fragile way of living.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about how, like, I mean, basically having so much of your living, not only subject to, like, the elements of, like, if you can grow enough, if you can trap enough, but I'm thinking, like, if your stove goes out,
yeah,
you're stuck.
You're screwed, man.
Like, you're screwed. You can't cook. You can't, like, heat your house. You can't do any of your laundry. Like, not to do the, like, oh, you kids today are so spoiled, blah, blah, blah. But I'm trying to think, like, what would this be analogous to today? Like, if your power goes out, if your electricity goes out, yeah, it sucks for a little while, but we still have, like, packaged dry food for the most part. A lot of us have, like, if you've got a gas stove, then that's not really a factor.
In places in Montana, at least, like, around where we live, if your power goes out, you can't, like, flush your toilet because, like, the pumps are on electricity. And so, like, you can't get water either because from the well, the pumps are electricity. And so you're just kind of sitting there. You can't wash your clothes. You can't drink any water. You can't... Well, we have a gas stove, so it's fine. But, like, if you had an electric stove, you couldn't make any food. Mm-hmm. It would be difficult.
You get stinky.
You get stinky real fast. And so you had, like, the cook stove where everything kind of happened around in terms of food. But there was also a lot of different ways you could keep food and, like, preserve food because they didn't have refrigerators as we know them today. And so, like, just for, like, your preserved food or your bread or, like, spices or whatever, pioneers would use pantries or a small room or corner where they store these kind of, like, dry foods. Pretty much similar to what we have today. They also often had root cellars. These were holes that were dug into the ground under the cabin or into a hillside that were used to keep potatoes, apples, carrots, cabbages, like some pretty hardy vegetables, to keep them chill but not too cold so they wouldn't freeze during the winter. So this was like basically their version of a refrigerator because the underground had like a nice pretty even temperature to keep things cool but stop them from freezing during the harsh Minnesotan winters.
Mm-hmm. And that's also where you go to hide from the tornado.
Yeah, that's
the
where you
root
go.
cellar.
It's the tornado hide.
Is it root cellar? Like, root cellars to me, and probably just because of, like, where I have lived and grown up, seem very mythical to me. Like, we do not have those
we don't have
here.
those. They would be flooded like nobody's business.
Yeah. I'm certain that they, like, really exist, but when people talk about, like, oh, the root cellar, I'm like, it seems a little fake to me. Like,
Sounds fake, but okay.
Exactly, yeah. Like, I'm sure it's a real thing, but I'm also like, I've never really seen one.
No, I've never.
It's like a narwhal.
Maybe my grandma has one in her old house. But yeah, I've never seen one either. They would also have a smokehouse, which was basically like a little wooden shack somewhere on the property for curing meat to make it last longer. So, like, if you grew a pig, you raised a pig, and it was time to say goodbye to Mr. Pig, you wanted to make sure you used every last ounce of Mr. Pig. And so, what you couldn't eat fresh, you would usually cure to make it last a little longer. And they also often hung fruits and nuts and veggies out on, like, the cabin and, like, kind of like, like those party banners?
Oh, yeah.
There's some pictures where it's just, like, a bunch of, like, vegetables or, like, corn or something, but they're hung, like, party banners, like, on the front of a cabin. I'm like, oh, it's a corn party. Conversely,
I bet it's a very macabre, like, type of party banner that's just a bunch of, like, pork bits, Because I do know that's kind of what, like a butcher shop or a smokehouse would look like, of just, like, some animal bits just
some
hanging.
Animal bits. Yeah, so fruits, nuts, or veggies would either be hung or, like, laid out on stones to dry out and, essentially make raisins, preserve some fruits. And then they were kept in either crocks or bags to store them. And if you had, like, it was the summertime, you went out, you picked some blackberries, and you had a lot, you would just usually make whatever you were eating fresh into jam to keep that longer, too. Yeah. So there was a lot of just, like, preservation. I feel like fresh vegetables or fruits or meat was, like, a very special thing, but most of it went to preserving, because again, you wouldn't know if you would have food later. So you had to make sure you had a lot of backup. You had to have backups for your backup.
I know that, I'm not sure if this is as true in this time period, but maybe a little bit later. I know, like, Christmas gifts, or like a special Christmas gift that people would sometimes give is like oranges. You know, where you get like fresh fruit.
Yeah.
Because it's such a like rare thing to have. I mean, especially in the days like before real refrigeration, having any kind of like fresh food or fresh fruits or vegetables is really like special.
Yeah, I should probably save this for like a food fact of the day later. But we're on the topic now. I know in like the 1700s, a little bit earlier, people would rent pineapples to display in their home during Christmas time because, like, you know, fresh fruits, like you said, were so rare that people who were really rich, like governors and stuff, would rent pineapples as centerpieces to show off during Christmas time. There is, in North Carolina, there's an old governor's mansion called Tryon's Place. Maybe it's Tryon's Palace. Anyway, but we went there, they have tours there, and there was one Christmas that we went there, and it was 90 degrees, but they had decorated it historically accurately, so they had all this fresh fruit just hung up in these giant garlands everywhere, and it was rotting, and it was falling down on people, and it smelled terrible, and it was gross, but it was accurate in the sense of, like, wealthy people would rent fruit to display in their homes.
That's wacky.
Yeah.
That's wacky.
For Christmas. So moving into, like, we've made the food, right? We've preserved the fruits, we
have our jams.
We've said goodbye to Mr. Pig. We have our jams, we have our veggies. Now it's time to set the table. So in terms of tableware and, like, setting the table for a meal, it was not fancy on the frontier. Again, like, you had one trunk, if you were lucky, and you basically only had dish sets of whatever you could find or make. Most families did not have any sort of matching dish sets. They usually only had enough dishware for, like, one person to have their own plate or knife or fork or spoon if they were lucky.
If you're little Thieme, you better not drop that plate.
Yeah, man.
You're not getting another one.
You're not getting another one. And you probably have to share with your brother.
Yeah. It's gonna be like the episode of Parks and Rec where Andy and April have no clean dishes, so they're eating chili off of a Frisbee and they're sharing a fork.
No! That's terrible. Dishware could have come like all the way from Sweden if it was incredibly lucky to get there, or maybe it was bought at like a local general store for a special occasion. Often bowls and spoons, cups and plates were carved from wood by the family, so like Kirsten's older brother would often do that. Pioneer tables didn't have any tablecloths or napkins because that would mean more laundry, and ain't nobody got time for that when you have to fight bears.
That's good. I'm thinking, like, and maybe the dishware that came from Sweden was wooden or something, but the idea of, like, shipping dishes internationally like that gives me hives.
Yeah.
It makes me so stressed. As someone who has had to pack and just move across the United States a couple of times, I had so much anxiety about, like, my dishes are all, I should say goodbye to them now, they're all gonna break. That's my fear.
It's terrifying. Yeah, I've done the same thing. I think we made it through unscathed. Whenever something's mailed to us, it always breaks.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna be mailing myself any dishes anytime soon. So we've talked about a little bit about pioneer parties. So pioneers didn't have time to party because they were busy not dying.
Yeah, fighting bears.
And fighting bears. But, you know, people are social animals. We like to get together and hang out. So usually what would happen is groups of people would have bees. B-E-E-S. And a bee is a work party. And it was the main way to socialize for Swedish families on the frontier. They didn't really have leisure time, so as a way to still hang out and have fun, families would come together and get seasonal work done while hanging out. So maybe like in the spring or summer, you have all those berries, you know, they'd have a bee where a bunch of people would come together and make like a bunch of jam and then maybe eat some of the jam at the end of the day. It was kind of like a meal prep party, so kind of like what we did actually the other day when we were making food. You know, you came over to hang out, but we were also working by making all the food, and then we tried some, and it was great. Yeah. A little bit of etymology, because I love a little etymology. The term bee, you know, like a spelling bee or whatever, partially comes from the Dutch word bij. I think it's also kind of pronounced bij, which is a meeting for communal work or amusement.
And this kind of work party should not be confused with when morale at your office is shit poor and your boss has a pizza party and they order like 2 mediums from Domino's, you know?
You can't see the far off look in my eye right now, dear listener, but I am in the trenches once again.
Yeah. I think we should bring these back.
Like the Fundies?
Yes. I think so. I've heard of this sort of similar trend. This is also, dear listener, if you don't know, if you've ever heard of like a barn raising, that's exactly what we're talking about. Like families on the Pioneer would literally all get together to raise a barn like for one family, but it would also be a social thing. And I think now we use the term like it's going to be a barn raising as like everybody in the community is going to come together to try to help one family. I've heard of this trend that's going on lately that I think is great, and I love this idea. So if you have, like, a friend who is pregnant, who's expecting a baby, rather than giving her a baby shower where it's like, oh, she has to sit around and, like, everybody gives her gifts and all that type of stuff. Instead, people have been throwing nesting parties.
Ooh.
Do you know about this?
No, I don't.
Okay, so a nesting party is, like, people that would normally come over for a baby shower, all of your female friends, relatives, that type of stuff. They come over to your house and they, like, clean the house. They help you get ready for the baby. So they maybe do a lot of, like, meal prepping. They, like, give your house a deep clean. They make sure the nursery is all set up.
Oh my
and
gosh.
I love this.
I love that.
So I think it's a very similar vibe.
That's more helpful than a shower, for sure.
Yeah, because there's something to be said about showers can be, I mean, we've both had bridal showers. It's like, there's some element of just, like, you sitting around and, like, you're supposed to just look pretty and everyone watches you open gifts and it's a little weird.
Everyone's just gotta stare at you like you're a little zoo animal.
Yeah, it does. Especially when you're pregnant, I feel like people love to stare at you like you're a zoo animal.
Yeah.
I mean, as someone who has not been pregnant, but that's my understanding. Even, I'll say, I have even been the person staring at pregnant people and been like, weird. This is weird.
I don't like this. I want to do something.
Yeah.
Do something useful. I like that. I like nesting part. We do need to bring bees back more often. Like, you know, you've got your friend who maybe had a surgery.
Yeah.
Have a little, like, meal prep bee.
Yeah. I'm also a huge proponent of, like, the grief cooking for people. Like, if you have someone who has recently lost a family member or a friend, bringing over a casserole, giving them even, like, a DoorDash card, you know, and I'll say, so helpful as someone who has been there.
Yeah. You
cannot even think about, like, the mental fog that you feel.
It's hard enough to try and figure out what you're eating for dinner on, like, a good day.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's true. That's true.
You just don't want to think about that stuff when you're going through it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, now that I've talked about Kirsten, Nicole, I believe it's time for our not food fact of the day.
It is. Yes. Well, we should still go.
Let's go.
We are breaking the rules that we have made, so I think it's fine. And everything is also made up and pointless and nothing matters. So I think it's fine. Normally, the food fact of the day, we try to do something that's, like, not related to what we're talking about. But since we feel like we have a lot of stuff we want to talk about today, our food fact of the day is going to be talking about our experiences cooking stuff from the American Girl cookbooks.
Yes.
So, who wants to go first?
I just did Kirsten, so I'll go first. So Kirsten's little cookbook has a lot of Swedish pioneer food. As you may or may not know, my lovely listeners, I have a dairy allergy, and I also don't eat meat. So trying to cook pioneer Swedish food where it's just like, you want some butter? You want butter on your pork chop? I was just like, not really, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, very heavy on the, like, animal products.
And so I decided to choose two pretty, like, one that I knew was probably going to be good, and then, like, one recipe where I was just like, I just have to know.
What is this?
Yeah. So one of them was Swedish almond rusks, and they're kind of like a biscotti if it was pound cake shaped.
Yeah, it's very much like a bread.
Yeah, it's like a bread.
It's a loaf.
It's like double toasted. These cookbooks probably came out in what, like the 90s or something?
1994.
Yeah, you know, these cookbooks came in the 90s, and so these recipes are very much of that time period. So the ingredients for, like, the almond rusks contained a lot of shortening, because we were pretty much, like, no butter at that time. And it's just, like, basically, like, a pound cake with some almonds in it that was, like, double cooked, so it was a little toastier. But it was pretty delicious. Like, the almond rusks came out real nice. They smelled great.
Did you try them with coffee?
I did. It was delightful.
Yeah. I took some of the almond rusks home after we had cooked them, and I put a slice in the toaster oven for a minute or so to kind of warm it back up and make it just a little bit crispy, and I had it with a glass of cold oat milk, and it hit. It was hitting for me.
Always hits. David would have loved it with, like, some jam spread on top. Mm-hmm. I'm not a jam person. I wouldn't have survived on the Pioneer.
You don't jam with jam?
I don't jam with jam. They'd be like, oh, she's dead. She didn't eat the jam. She didn't eat the meat or the butter.
You would be out there eating your dandelion greens.
Yeah, I would
just
be.
Mouthfuls of
yum,
grass.
Yum, yum. I'd be a cow.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, in terms of recipe, like, the actual word recipe, it was easy to follow. It was pretty basic. And it turned out really tasty. The other recipe I chose...
I was laughing already.
Was called... I have to get close to the mic for this one. It was called fruit soup. I'll say it again. Fruit soup. If you are confused about fruit soup, I was too.
Join the club.
The picture that comes with it, it looks like fruit soup, man. There's really nothing else I can say.
The picture, like, when I was originally looking at it, it looks sort of like if you've ever seen those Japanese tarts that are just, like, fruit in just, like, a clear gelatin, you know? Like, not even, like, Jell-O, but just, like, clear gelatin. It looks like that, but it is also very watery.
If you had a really syrupy fruit cup, kind of is what it looks like. And this was supposed to be a dessert, fruit soup, and the ingredients are just, like, dried mixed fruit, water, raisins, a cinnamon stick, cornstarch, and more water. You can imagine how great it tasted. Yeah. It actually isn't that bad. So
very perplexing for sure.
Very perplexing. To make fruit soup, you just put the fruit in the water and you let it soak, and then you boil it, and then you add the cornstarch and the cinnamon stick. I don't know where to start with fruit soup, to be honest. Making it looked like I was a witch having like a little cauldron, making like a little potion. Tasting it just tasted like dried fruit that had been heated up with water. It was fine. Like, it wasn't bad, you know. It's not bad. It just was what it was.
I think it was definitely one of those foods that I had to, I don't know if you have ever experienced this, dear listener, but, like, where you have to keep eating it to find out, like, do I like this? How do I feel about this?
Yeah. I have not tried the fruit soup cold. It's been in a fridge in my parents' basement for a bit. It might be better, because we had it when it was, like, still warm.
Yeah. I think it says you can serve it warm or cold, though, right?
And so, I think, like, you know, my family is here, we all tried it, and they were like, I don't like this on its own, but it would be good on top of yogurt.
Or oatmeal.
Or oatmeal, or ice cream, or pancakes. It's a topper. It is not a soup. It is like it's stewed fruit topper. You know. Yeah. It's not soup. Don't eat it like soup, please.
The number of contradictions present in fruit soup are vast.
Like, I'm glad I did it, but did it take maybe a year off of my life? Probably.
Was it challenging in preparation? No. Was it challenging emotionally, spiritually, mentally? Yes. Religiously.
I lost my religion that day.
You became the REM song.
That's me in the corner. That's me with the fruit soup. Losing
my religion. Alright, we have to stop before we get copyright flagged. REM's gonna come asking questions.
Hopefully not about the fruit soup, because I wouldn't know how to answer that.
So I chose to cook from Samantha's cookbook. So as a reminder, Samantha is from the time period 1904, so your Victorian, turn of the century era. I sort of took the same approach as Julia. I was also struggling with, like, what to make from this cookbook, because there are a lot of things in here that are just sort of, like, normal, you know? Like, there's green beans that's just, like, boil some green beans. Mm-hmm. Here you go.
I think there's one that's just, like, lettuce.
So they have a salad, and I'm making air quotes here, recipe in this cookbook that is just, I bet I can find it. It's truly romaine lettuce, chives, tarragon leaves, and salad dressing. So it's literally just lettuce. And I will say it's probably historically accurate, because at around this time, this is when we actually are able to start getting fresh fruits and vegetables, like, shipped to us. So basically what happens is we invent iceberg lettuce. We figure out how to transport it, like, back east from, California. And people are wild for it. It's so wild that we can have fresh lettuce that people just want to eat that and just put some dressing on it and have a salad. So I was like, well, it's a little boring. So similar to Julia, I have similar restrictions about some meats and dairy and all that type of stuff. So trying to find one recipe in here that we could both eat was a little challenging. But we ended up making one normal recipe and one Buck Wild recipe.
Of course.
So we made Saratoga potatoes, which is actually listed as a breakfast food, which is interesting.
Really?
Yeah, it says fried Saratoga potatoes add a crispy crunch to breakfast.
Huh.
And they're just potato chips. Like, they're just little fried potatoes. You just slice some potatoes real thin, and then you fry them, again, in shortening. And that's it. Then you put some salt on them. They're good. But it's just fried potatoes.
Fried, salted potatoes. They were quite tasty.
Peek behind the curtain, but this is where I got the inspiration to do the food fact of the day a couple episodes ago about the origin of potato chips. Mm-hmm. They have a little factoid in here about, like, Moon's Lake House, located in Saratoga Springs, New York, and the whole discourse about, like, who invented potato chips. So we did Saratoga potatoes. Those were fine. And then, because we are freaks. I guess I should say me. I don't know.
I think I was also like, do the corn oysters.
Yeah, so we did this recipe that is called corn oysters. Contains no oysters. Not actually an oyster or seafood in any way. They are little corn patties that are just like corn kernels that have like I'll give you the ingredients and maybe this will help. Not really, but corn kernels, milk, flour, egg, salt, pepper, and then you just fry them. So you just take some corn kernels and you just make them in a little batter, and then you just fry them and eat them.
Little corn fritters.
And I was especially intrigued by the flavor text that is given here in the cookbook that says, because they have these like little fried corn oysters on a fancy Victorian plate with some little like carrot rosettes. And the text says, corn patties shaped like oysters look elegant on the table. And Julia and I were both like, do they?
Do they? I don't know. They look like lumps.
They look like little blobs.
Look like little blobs.
And they tasted, I think, exactly as you would expect.
Like
little
corn.
Blobs of corn.
Little blobs of corn.
Yeah.
They were, again, fine. I would rather have had either corn or oysters.
Yeah. Yeah, it just feels like a really half-assed version of, like, cornbread or a hush puppy.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's like, couldn't we just do that? And I will say, to give some credence to the cookbook, there's also a recipe in here for gingerbread. That is, like, soft gingerbread that, is more of like a cake that I made last Christmas that is very good. Mm-hmm. So, if you do get the cookbook, it's not all wild corn patty nonsense.
Fruit soup.
Just not all nonsense. So... Well, Julia, should I tell the people at home more about Samantha Parkington?
Oh my gosh, I made my section purposefully shorter so I could hear you talk more about the Victorian era.
I also tried to keep my I also was like, I have so many things I could say, but I'm going to intentionally rein it in because we'll be here forever.
We'll be here forever. I'm so ready to hear about Samantha.
Okay, so as I said, I picked Samantha's cookbook. So Samantha Parkington, her story takes place in the Victorian period, or about 1904, in upstate New York. So she is a rich white girl. Cue the Hall & Oates. You're a rich girl, and you got to. And now we're gonna get a second copyright infringement request. So Samantha is an orphan. Her parents have died, so she lives with her grandmother, who's called Grand Mary. Like I said, she's like old money, but despite her very privileged background, she's usually very generous, and she struggles with social expectations to be like a lady.
Does it say how her parents died?
Yes, they died in a horrible boating accident.
Oh gosh.
They drowned.
Oh my god.
Yeah. For research, I pulled my books off the shelf and was rereading Samantha's series and Kirsten's series. So because Samantha's family is like super rich, they also have like a lake house, just like property on this place called Piney Point, which I guess is when they're tired of being rich in New York, they're like, let's go play in the woods, hee hee hee. That is also on a lake, so there's like this little island that I guess her parents were out boating to, and they, like, drowned.
Oh my god.
When she was, like, 5 or so. And then in the book, Samantha and her, like, little friends go out to the island, and then they almost have a bad time. There's this, like, big storm, and Samantha's like, this is probably what it was like when my parents died. And we're like,
Lord,
are you okay? I don't know if we have therapy yet. Therapy in 1904 is probably not great, but someone should talk to this child.
Yeah, if you haven't read the American Girl books, they don't mess around. They do not mess around.
We didn't even talk about how Kirsten is just, like, immune from cholera.
Yeah!
In the first Kirsten book, I reread it just the other day as an adult, almost 30 years old, and I was like, fuck, man, this sucks. The first Kirsten book is, like, she makes friends with this other Swedish girl who's, like, her age that's also coming to Minnesota, and the girl just, like, catches cholera on the ship and just dies.
Yep.
And they're just like, she's gone to heaven now. And it's like, sorry, what? Hello? Marta? Hello?
So if you were 9 or 10 reading the American Girl books,
if you were similarly traumatized, you may be entitled to financial compensation.
Exactly.
From the Pleasant Company. Okay, so going back to Samantha. So in addition to death, I guess.
Yep.
Some themes that were in her books are the idea of, like, progress, in quotes. We have rapid technological innovations and industrialization. With that, we also have child labor, immigration. We have wealth and privilege, obviously. There's xenophobia. There's education and literacy. Early first wave feminism with the suffrage movement. And then some stuff about adoption and blended families as well. Samantha's cookbook has, similar to Kirsten's cookbook, 3 sections. There's breakfast, dinner, and favorite foods. There are some sort of historical sections about dining in the early 1900s, servants and serving, how to set the table, and then a section about how to plan a tea party. Tea party today that's, like, vaguely similar to Victorian tea party. So, let's talk about cooking in Victorian times. Victorian times roughly maps the reign of Queen Victoria, and a little bit before, a little bit after. Broad strokes, we're talking about, like, 1820 to 1914.
It's almost 100 years.
Yeah, so it's a pretty broad period. I think the Victorian period is a little bit different in American history versus in British culture.
That's very true.
So I guess, like, specifically we're thinking about, like, the turn of the century, right? And that idea of, like, I don't know, I always think of the, for those folks that have been to Walt Disney World, the Carousel of Progress. Mm-hmm. I could sing another song that could get us maybe a 3rd copyright strike, but the mouse don't mess around, so
mouse don't.
But if you've ever been on the Carousel of Progress that sings about there being a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, and the progress and all the innovations and things like that. That's what I always think of with this time period. Obviously, cooking in this time period is going to be really different depending on your income or your socioeconomic status. We're mostly going to talk about what it's like for the wealthy because that's, Samantha's pretty well off. So rich families like hers usually had servants doing all of the cooking, and the woman of the house, which would be Grand Mary, plans all of the meals. So Grand Mary sort of decides, like, on the menu for the day. Oh. She gives it to Mrs. Hawkins, who is the cook for the house, and then Mrs. Hawkins calls, perhaps using the new telephone.
Ooh.
Or she sends, like, somebody on an errand to town to place an order with the butcher and the grocer. And they actually get stuff delivered, because I guess when you're rich, people just, like, take stuff to your house.
Well, okay.
This is even, like, before we got DoorDash.
Dang, man. Do they have, like, an incredible upcharge for that?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, also, towns are a lot smaller.
That's true.
So it's less, I mean, we don't quite have cars yet. We're not car-focused cities, so there's less of, like, you gotta drive places, so stuff had to be closer. There's some school of thought that girls, even if you are rich, if you're well off, you should still have some idea of, like, how to cook or know your way around the kitchen, since you're, like, the head of the household. This is about Fanny Farmer's
I was
time.
about to say, baby!
She's in here, don't worry.
My girl!
Friend of the show, Fanny Farmer. The Boston Cooking School Cookbook comes out in 1896, so that's only, like, 8 years before Samantha's story in 1904, right? That is still very much, like, the cultural goop that they're swimming in. Mm-hmm. I mean, like I've said, there's a lot of new technology happening at this point in history. Ford Motor Company is established in 1903. So, like, you know, we've got some automobiles, we've got telephones, electricity is starting to be adopted. We have gas lamps so we can see at night. We're not restricted to just like the daytime. And then we have candles, and then everybody just kind of goes to bed because it's dark and you can't do anything. In terms of food technology, we don't quite have refrigeration, but we are close, I guess. So if you're a wealthy family, you probably have an ice box, which is like straight up like a cabinet that has like a giant block of ice that helps keep your food cold. But the ice usually melts by like the end of the day. So it's definitely not refrigeration like we have today, but it's like we're getting there.
An evolution from the root cellar.
Yes, definitely. We also have, again, if you're a wealthy family or if you live more in a city, you have the milkman who's delivering fresh milk every morning, taking your empty bottles. We have refrigerated railroad cars that are able to ship meat and produce across the country. It's not refrigerated in the sense of like air conditioning like we have today, but it's this interesting system of like they have fans and ice and like, so I didn't really understand how it works, but I was like, okay, interesting. We're able to get access to more foods than just like in Kirsten's time where it's like, well, this is what I could grow on my farm and that's what I have to eat.
Samantha and Kirsten are very, like, opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I feel like they're definitely very distinct periods, even though ostensibly they're only 50 years apart.
I know, which is crazy.
Yeah.
But, like, over in New York, Samantha's family's having, like, meat delivered to them.
They're having their fresh little lettuce salad.
Yeah, their fresh lettuce salad, having their meat, like, brought to their house, having, the milk brought to their house. Meanwhile, like, Kirsten's dragging water from a river and fighting bears and, like, digging up potatoes.
Yeah. So, since Julia talked about the stove, I also wanted to talk about the stove. So if you're a richer family, you might have a gas stove. If you are not so well off, you might have a cast iron stove or, like, a fire combination. Sort of similar to what Kirsten would have. Gas stoves are obviously have a much more consistent temperature as opposed to like a fire you'd have to feed, right? So there's less of the like, well, I'm going to just put my hand here and assume this is how hot it is. With gas, you have a much more consistent cooking temperature. So here's some
oh my god, that's
pictures.
so cute!
So we've got, cast iron. There's like a little fire that is kind of built in. Then you've also got a little door that opens up for your baking. And then on top, you've got cook stove. This is all cast iron. And then this is maybe a little bit newer. This one's identified as like 1900 to 1920, but this is sort of what the gas stove would look like. So you've again got kind of like a drawer for an oven, and then you have, it's not dissimilar from what we would have today as a gas stove.
Yeah, it's pretty
like
similar.
Your typical range that has the gas that like feeds the little burners, and you've got knobs.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll probably have to do an episode or maybe a food fact of the day about like kitchen architecture, because the modern idea of a kitchen where everything is the same level, your cook stove, your sink, your countertops, is relatively modern. I think that came about in like the 40s or 50s.
Yeah.
So like these old gas stoves are very vertical, it wouldn't be like a big flat range on the top and then an oven underneath. It's got like a little range on the side and like two ovens stacked up next to it.
Right. So, like Julia talked about setting the table in pioneer times, setting the table in Victorian times is a big deal, very fancy. I could talk about, like, Victorian dinner etiquette, but that is a whole other episode. I would actually recommend, there's an episode of Schmanners that goes over Victorian dining etiquette. You and I went to a Victorian dinner.
We did. It was so lovely.
It was fun. We had a Victorian Christmas dinner as part of a class.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to talk about, like, all the etiquette in terms of dining. Just know that dining is, like, a huge deal. There's lots of manners and pomp and circumstance. We have, as opposed to, Kirsten's time, where we have, like, you get one bowl and you get one plate. You better like it. And again, we're also talking about vastly different socioeconomic classes here. But a proper Victorian dining room would have many fancy dishes and plates and ornaments, even for, like, specific foods, right? Like, we have banana boats, which are specifically for bananas. Mm-hmm. We have serving dishes and utensils for sardines. We have celery vases.
The celery vases! I love those.
Alton Brown would hate this, because I don't know if you know Alton Brown's diatribe about, like, you shouldn't have any of those, like, really specific cooking utensils.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I'm like, he would hate this. There's also, I mean, this is also getting into, I'm going to put on my sociologist hat. We're talking about, like, conspicuous consumption here. Do you know what I mean when I say that? Yeah. Of, like...
You're showing your wealth.
I'm showing my wealth. I have lots of opulent crystal, silver, fine linens, fine china. Lots of fuss over how things look and proper etiquette, all that type of stuff.
We love conspicuous consumption in our modern era.
Oh, Americans are wild for it. That's our bread and butter. So we've set the table. So what are we eating at this point?
Food.
So I'm going to quickly walk through like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Another like quick fact that I learned in my research for this is the concept of like sort of our modern concept of having 3 meals a day, and roughly the times that we eat those come from the Victorian era.
Yeah.
Of like, you know, eating breakfast roughly around, 8 o'clock, lunch around like noon or 1, and then dinner. There's some confusion about supper and dinner, but later in the evening. That's comes from the Victorian era, which is cool.
I didn't talk about it much, and I didn't mention it at all, but in Kirsten's, like, her meal was breakfast, like, at the crack of dawn as soon as you got up, so that would be, like, 5 or 6. And then you worked all day, and you had what we would call, like, well, it's kind of like what we would call lunch, but for them it was dinner around, like, 2 or 3. And then you would have supper later in the evening, which was usually, like, leftovers from dinner. Yeah. So that was very different, where you'd have a big hearty breakfast, and then a big hearty meal when you got home, and then little snackies in the evening before you went to bed.
The late night snacky. For the Victorian era, for breakfast, we are having whatever fruit might be in season, some type of cereal, either hot cereal like oatmeal or cold cereal. We do actually, this is where we start to get some of our cornflakes.
I was about to say, got them cornflakes.
Yeah, cornflakes, grape nuts, those types of cold cereals. People had opinions about those, but we'll save those for when we eventually do an episode about cereal, I'm sure. Adults would have coffee or tea. Children would often have cocoa. There's a lot of, like, cocoa is considered nutritious for children. I think there's even a quote from Fanny Farmer that was like, children should have cocoa because it's nutritious, which is, like, cute.
Which I think that kind of carries through today, because we have, like, chocolate milk and stuff.
That's true.
Might have to look into that.
You have eggs, some kind of meat or fish, maybe, potatoes, and then some kind of bread, so toast, bread, muffins, waffles, pancakes, biscuits. So these are pretty much like what we would have for breakfast today, right?
Yeah,
not
very
dissimilar.
similar.
For lunch, so men are often out of the house working, so lunch as a meal is usually going to be for who's home, so women and children. Well-to-do women would maybe have like a luncheon for close friends, and this was a way to like get together with friends without a lot of the like pomp and circumstance and rigid etiquette that you would have for dinner. So it was just like, hey girls, like, come over, we're gonna have a cute little luncheon. And you just have a much more kind of simple meal. You might have a hot luncheon or a cold luncheon. So just think like, sort of like we would have today, of like maybe just some sandwiches or maybe a simple roast or something like that.
Cute.
Some salad. It sounds very nice.
It sounds nice.
And then for dinner, you cannot overstate the importance of the Victorian dinner. Dinner is the big showstopper, as you might say if you're a Great British Bake Off fan.
I'm just like thinking about how, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure like since dinner was the social event of essentially every day, you would like change your outfit.
Yes.
You would like get ready.
Yep. You would dress for dinner. I'm just like sitting here being like, I would be so exhausted.
Yeah. You have your whole day, and then you have to, like, spend another 4 hours just, like, for dinner.
Making sure that you don't accidentally broach some inappropriate topic.
You don't pick up the wrong spoon.
Yeah, Mrs. Winston's. Yeah, and get shunned from the social circle.
I would be shunned so fast.
Yeah, as a couple of introverts, this does sound exhausting. But here we are, we're also like, oh, this sounds so fun. We should
It's so cute. But I'm also just like, I don't know.
The stakes are a lot lower for us,
that's
today.
True.
We can play pretend. Let's see. So, I mean, basic structure of, like, what are we having for dinner is you have multiple courses, usually. So you have some kind of soup or fish and appetizers. So you might have oysters, anchovies, olives, pickles, along with some kind of, like, soup or maybe a fish dish. Then your next course is going to be your meats and vegetables. So you might have roast or some kind of meat or poultry accompanied by vegetables, or maybe a salad, which, as we have said, very new, very exciting.
Mm-hmm,
These green little leaves in a bowl, wild
Incredible.
stuff. And then your last course would be dessert. If you are having people over, so, if we're having, like, a big dinner party, you're going to spread these out over multiple courses. So you might have, like, multiple meat dishes, multiple appetizers, because, again, it's also, like, you're showing your wealth. I can afford to buy this amount of food. And I can afford to buy these fancy, a giant goose or a pineapple or whatever. The other meal that I would say that we have is tea, which is also, like, very ritualistic, regimented. We have a lot of rules about tea. We have afternoon tea and we have evening tea. So afternoon tea is in between lunch and dinner, or what I would call 3 o'clock snack time.
3 o'clock snack time.
And then evening tea is the last meal of the day, served, like, later in the evening after dinner. So ladies would often have afternoon tea parties, which, as I said, is described in Samantha's cookbook. They give you some ideas for, like, if you are a 10-year-old girl and you would like to have a tea party.
Who wouldn't,
to be
honest?
They talk about you could have a garden tea party that you have outside. You might have a doll tea party, which, like, makes sense for American Girl. And something else that I found mentioned in the cookbook, but that I couldn't find anything else about, was a color tea, which is, like, everything on the table should all be one color.
Oh.
Including the tablecloth, the dishes, like, even the food. Everybody should also wear the same color.
Oh, dang.
Which I'm like, that's interesting. I don't know. I couldn't find any other resources about it, but I hope it's a real thing. For tea, you would obviously drink tea. You would have some bread and butter, maybe a cold meat, a hot relish, which I was like, what is that? That just means baked eggs, roast oysters, boiled sausages.
Okay.
Not like a literal, like, when I hear relish, I think of, like, the
Pickle
stuff.
relish.
Yeah, like pickle relish for a hot dog. You would also probably have, cake, biscuits, cookies, crumpets, some kind of, like, little bread treat, and some fruit.
That sounds so nice, man.
It does.
I'm also hungry, but...
I know, it's getting to be lunchtime, so I'm like, ooh.
Ooh.
I was reading about Victorian tea the other day, and it was also getting to be lunchtime, so I then made myself a fancy little plate of, like, some breads with some butters and jellies. And,
so cute.
You know.
I love how, like, tea, especially evening tea, is essentially, like, the historical equivalent of girl dinner.
Oh my god. Yeah.
There's, like, ooh, a little bit of, like, cold meat, little, like, snackies.
Yeah.
Like, fruit, little olives.
Anything that could be held between tiny pinched fingers.
Yeah.
You know.
And eaten like a little raccoon.
Yes. Nyang, 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 nyang. So we have now talked about, each of these cookbooks and American Girls, but I think to cap us off, again, we're sort of breaking the rules with this episode in a lot of ways, but I think before we close, we should get wiggy with it.
Let's do a quick get wiggy with it.
Wig, 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 wig,
Woo,
wig,
woo,
wig.
woo, woo, woo.
I mean, we sort of mentioned how, like, obviously American Girl is not perfect.
Yeah.
Let's put the tiger on the table and remind ourselves that, like, yes, it started out as, like, partially an educational tool, but also we still live under capitalism.
Yep.
It is still a business to sell dolls to make money.
Specifically to, like, a white middle-class consumer audience.
Yes, and that's very much true, even at the beginning with the, like, direct mail of, like, mailing catalogs to people. And, I mean, we should also say that the price point for these dolls, I don't think we've mentioned that
I don't
yet.
think we did.
They're pretty high, which is something that, like, that's the reason I was able to have, like, several dolls, is because I had a well-to-do grandmother who was able to buy them for me. But, like, that was something that was, like, they're not like Barbie in the sense of, like, you can go to the drugstore and get a new Barbie, right?
Yeah.
It was a big special purchase that I would almost equate to, like, maybe a new gaming system.
Yeah, I'm, like, looking at the prices right now, and I'm like, these seem cheaper than I remember, because currently they're only, like, $115, but I'm pretty sure when we were kids, they were over $200.
I remember them being about $100, but also if you consider inflation, like, $100 20 years ago is very different than $115 today.
Yeah.
So...
Maybe it's because I got, like, a lot of the fancy stuff with it.
That's true. You may have gotten a bundle.
I did. My parents probably did get me bundles.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, $100-something for a doll is...
And that's, like, basic, right?
Yeah.
Because there's, of course, you can get extra dresses, accessories, clothes, pets. You can get a horse.
You can get
some
beds,
furniture.
It is pricey. And Nicole and I, when we both worked together at an office, we would often do like those charity gifts. So like, you know,
I think it's called Angel Tree.
Angel Tree.
Where you like adopt, quote unquote, a child, and there's like a child who says like, I want this for Christmas.
Mm-hmm. And every year without fail, there would be someone who wanted an American Girl doll, whose family could obviously not afford one because they are pricey.
And our little eyes would tear up, and we'd be like, "We're gonna get you that fucking doll. We're gonna get it for you, little girl.
You're getting the doll."
Yeah, they're also like collectible. That was always like, even from a young age, I understood that, and maybe I'm sure there's some marketing with this as well. Of like, yes, this is a toy, but it is also like collectible. You should be gentle with it. You know, definitely do not give her a haircut like you might with a Barbie. You know?
Yeah, these were elevated, to say the least.
I think because they cost so much.
Because they cost so much, because they were also, like, educational. There's, like, this sense of heirloom to them.
Yes.
You know, like, they're a piece of history. They're not, like, shallow like a Barbie doll. This is, like, just the marketing I remember. Mm-hmm. But it's, like, not shallow like a Barbie doll or, like, a Bratz doll. It's not about fashion. It's about, like, the American past.
Yeah. I mean, there's something to be said for, like, if you're just thinking in broad strokes about doll history, like, for a long time, we just had baby dolls, right? And with the idea is, like, young girls would want to imitate, like, being a mother and being caring. Then we get Barbie, which is more, like, aspirational of, like, I mean, Barbie's supposed to be a teenager at the beginning, but it's more of, like, when I get older or, like, an adult, something that you may want to, like, aspire to or imitate. American Girl is somewhere in the middle where it's someone who's more like you. Yeah. You know, like your age as like a, you know, preteen 10-year-old that's like a girl, so you're not quite an adolescent. It's not like I want to be like this when I grow up. It's more of like a analog to yourself, I think. Mm-hmm.
I think it's very true for most girls who grew up with American Girl doll. But the one that you love is the one that you felt represented you.
Yes.
I mean, I just loved Kaya so much because as a kid, I was very much like A, a horse girl, and B, loved Spirit Stallion of the Cimarron. And so it's very into the West, like the cultural, quote, West, end quote, of America.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's another reason why I identified a lot with Kit. Not only, like, I want to be a writer or, like, a reporter, you know, like, writing. I mean, she grew up in the Depression, and, like, I grew up in the recession era, right? Of the, like, housing crisis and whatever. And, like, I'm not trying to do the, like, poor me or whatever, but I'm also not trying to do the bootstraps thing. But, like, you know, my family had difficult financial times often. I identified with her of the idea of, like, making do, right? Or the, like, this is my family's situation, and, like, how are we going to work together to, like, how are we going to make the best of what we have and still have, you know, fun?
Yeah, like you mentioned, baby dolls were to imitate, Barbie dolls were to aspire to, but American Girl dolls you could relate to.
Yeah.
And
snap, 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 snap.
Snap, snap, snap. But like we were talking about a bit earlier, because of the people who were making them and because of the people they were marketed and aimed to, they're not the most probably racially accurate in terms of, like, I haven't read any of Addie's stories, but I do know there is some discourse around there about...
Oh, there's lots of discourse about Addie Walker.
Yeah, just a lot of Addie... Sorry, Addie is the Black American Girl doll from the 1800s?
1860s. Yeah, her whole thing, I mean, we won't get into it, but she is the quote-unquote slave doll. Yeah. Like, her time period is around the Civil War, and her story is, like, she is born into slavery, she and her mom, like, escape, and then she lives as a freed person, which is challenging. There were a lot of people who tried very hard to do their best, I think, but...
But yeah, that's a hard topic to write about, I feel like, for a 9 to 10-year-old girl. But also, at the same time, like we've discussed... You don't want to avoid it, either. American Girl books usually don't shy away if your friend dies from cholera or you have to fight a bear. Yeah. It's like, why would you be direct in those instances, but then, like, kind of skirt around the slavery thing is the discourse I've heard. Same with, like, Kaya and Singing Bird as well. There's a lot of discourse about, like, how natives are portrayed as kind of, like, usually just, like, harmless, happy the European people are there kind of thing. Which is, like... relationships are way more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's like, well, it's better than like, oh, they're terrible savages.
Yeah.
You know, but it's also like, it's still not great, or still not what we would sort of hope for, I guess.
Yeah, and it's like, you want something like American Girl doll to cover all of, like, America's history, not just the white kids. But then it's also difficult to sort of broach these really complicated stories of, like, you know, kids who were of color.
Again, putting on my sociologist hat, a lot of it comes down to, like, we as a society are still figuring out how to talk about slavery and racism, so it tracks that it would be an imperfect representation, you know?
I think there's also the level of, like, consumerism here. Like,
you are ultimately still trying to sell stuff.
Yeah, you're trying to, like, sell these dolls and sell these stories, and it's, like, it's easier to do that with, like, a white story, and then it's harder to sort of, like, try and commodify African American culture, or, like, African American slave history, or, like, commodify, like, the Nez Perce history and stuff like that. It's like, it feels icky to commodify that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Where it kind of doesn't if you're talking about Samantha and her fancy pants.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just...
as a business model.
It's sticky. It's a sticky thing. And, like, you know, American Girl very clearly is, like, something super close to Nicole and I's heart. It's imperfect, like we all are. But it did get us into history, and we are big history nerds. As you can clearly tell.
I will credit American Girl with getting me a 5, the highest score you can get on my AP US History test.
Wow.
I don't know.
Damn, man. That's impressive.
That had to help a little bit. Well, I think we can also thank American Girl for bringing us on this wild, interesting ride of making corn oysters and fruit soup.
I still have, like, a quart of fruit soup in my parents', like, middle-class second basement fridge. And I don't... Listeners, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm gonna do. I have to leave on Sunday.
Well,
the fruit soup's gonna haunt my parents' house for the end of their days.
It will never truly leave. And neither will we, except for right now, because we've reached the end of the episode.
All right.
Thanks for lunching with us.
We'll see you next time.
Bye. We are in person and we still can't get it quite synced.
We'll get it eventually.
Our theme music is Red Onions by Louis Zong. Please check out the rest of his album Vegetable Soul in the description. You can follow us on Twitter at Girls Lunch. Nicole is also on Twitter at NicoleH262, and her website is NicoleHilton.com. Julia is smarter than all of us and not on social media. Thank you for listening.
You know, I should have actually, like, looked this up before we started, but I forgot.
Oh, beans. I don't have internet right now.
Beans. Here, hold on.
We're gonna...